good evening, and welcome. Tonight we're going to be going over the history and geography of Malawi. Malawi is a landlocked country in Africa. Let me get pencil so I can point it out. It's in where Central and Southern Africa meet. It is bordered by Tanzania up here, by Zambia over here, and all over here we're bordered by Mozambique. And as you can see, the biggest geographic feature of Malawi is this huge lake known as Lake Malawi and sometimes Lake Nyasa, but we'll talk about why it's called that in its history. This lake is formed by the Great Rift Valley, where two tectonic plates in Africa are pulling apart, thus creating all of the Great Lakes. Lake Tanganyika is nearby. There's a few smaller lakes down here in Malawi, and many, many others. The most famous being Lake Victoria, which is just on that side up there of Tanzania. But here we are at Lake Malawi. There's a lot of neat little facts about Lake Malawi. I think it's either the deepest lake or the second deepest lake. It has very, very deep parts to it. And but what I think is most interesting is that Lake Malawi has the most species of fish in it than any other lake in the world. It has over 1,000 different species of fish living in it. So you can imagine that fishing is very important to the people who live in Malawi. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let me slow down. Lake Malawi has only one main tributary, which is this river that runs right down. It crisscrosses all over, but it is the Shire River, and this whole section down here is generally known as the Shire Highlands. And if that sounds a little bit Scottish to you, just wait. Down here in the Highlands, it's pretty hilly in some parts, kind of flat in others, but around here it gets pretty mountainous, and the highest point in Malawi is located right there. It is Mount Mulanje. I was going to say there's a town right next to it with the same name. It's the Mulanje Plateau as well. We do have a few other big rocky points right around here. You can really see the elevation. This area around here by the lake is very mountainous. We have another big plateau over here, the Nika Plateau. You can see there's a national park over here as well. But pretty much all down here and the parts down here is an area known as the Central African Plateau. It stretches through a lot of other places here in this area of Africa. But like I said, these tectonic plates are pulling apart, so it creates a lot of geographic features. So that's just one of them. And I'm sure a couple of million years, it won't be as flat. It'll be a lot more mountainous, or maybe there'll be more lakes. We shall see. The biggest cities in Malawi are, of course, the capital city here of Lilongwe. And the next one would be this city here called Blantyre. Lilongwe focuses as the main, it's the capital city, so it's the government center. Excuse my squeaky chair. And Blantyre is the economic center, where there's a lot of factories and industry. And if that sounds a little Scottish to you, just wait. I will explain it all. And that is pretty much it, other than what I found really interesting about Malawi geographically, I suppose it's a geographic fact, because usually in African countries like this, more people live in the cities than in the outskirts, but Malawi is one of the least developed countries in Africa, maybe even the world, and 85% of the population lives in the rural areas, not in the major cities. So all throughout here we get lots of forests and also lots of farmland as well. Malawi is an agricultural economy, it being not very developed, relying very heavily on farming and fishing, also from the lake. So it's, imagine that kind of population where it's not so much, people can't find jobs, so they move to the city where jobs are growing. It's pretty much the opposite in Malawi, where you have a better chance of having a steady income and job if you're a farmer or a fisher providing food, not just for the people, but also for export. And what I really like is that the border of Malawi runs through the lake. So, like, check this out. It goes like, it goes like this through the lake. So this is Mozambique right here. And there's this cool dip right here because there's two tiny little islands right there that Malawi refuses to allow Mozambique to have. So this is the border. I think that's really interesting how the lake is divided. So, since I've hinted at it so much, let me get into its history. So, being in the part of Africa that it is, in like central to southern Africa, like just south of central, just north of southern, basically, it was mainly just occupied by hunter-gatherer nomadic peoples for the most part of its early history until the Bantu migration, which I mentioned in pretty much any African countries south of West Africa. We'll do a whole video on it someday, I promise. So the Bantu migration comes in, the Bantu peoples move in the 10th century and settle, and eventually in this area, it covers most of Malawi and some of the surrounding areas, was the Malawi kingdom. It was in full swing by the year 1500, and it started off as like a bunch of tribal communities that eventually united under one ruler, where it was the strongest, and they conducted a lot of trade with many of the peoples around, and also Arab traders as well. And it fell apart in the same way that it formed, in that it wound up breaking into different tribes. Also, other tribes migrated into the area. There was the Ngoni tribe that came from the south. They were pushed out by the Zulu. And there was also the Yao tribe. And those two tribes wound up warring and pretty much tore the kingdom apart by the year 1700 or so. Also, slave trading became an issue at this point, where there were raiders coming in and kidnapping people from the area. So yeah, that kind of ruins things as well. The most prominent European explorer to enter this area was David Livingstone, as in Dr. Livingstone, I presume. In the year 1859, he discovered the lake. And he asked the people he was with, it was the Yao tribe, what this lake was called. And they told him it's a lake. Like, they didn't have a name for the lake. It wasn't like in Europe where you name your different lakes. It was just the lake. So they told him Nyasa, which was the word for lake. So he assumed that was the name of the lake. So he called it Lake Nyasa, and wrote in his notes that this area was Nyasaland because it was dominated by the big lake. So when he reported back to England with notes on how this area should be colonized, they referred to it as Nyasaland. And once the British did move in, they officially named their area Nyasaland. So what they did, because, I'm pretty sure the British were mainly looking at that point, because slavery was really not a thing to the British at that point. It was illegal to kidnap and sell people in England at that point. So they decided that they would Christianize the area and, using more civilized people to build up industry, basically. So, like, they were trying to figure out, should this be a plantation colony, like some growing colony? But they decided the best thing to do would be to convert the people, educate them, create an upper workforce, so to say. So, missionaries started to be established, and the city of Blantyre was formed. I had toppled the elephant over here, and I've been slowly pushing him off, sorry. The city of Blantyre was created to be a trading port and industry hub, which it still is today. So, this area has so many Scottish names because David Livingstone was from Scotland. I believe he's the one that named the area the Shire Highlands. But they named the city Blantyre because that was the town in Scotland where David Livingstone was born. There's other little pockets of his appearance in the area. Up here somewhere is Livingston. There it is. What is it called? Livingstonia. It's Livingstonia right there. Anyway, that's why this area sounds so Scottish. I assume they saw like the rolling hills and thought, oh, it's like Scotland, or at least David Livingstone maybe did. Anyway, also Britain did not want the Portuguese to get into this area because Portugal controlled Mozambique, if you see my Mozambique video. So they promptly sent their missionaries. I believe they were, they were British, so it was mainly Presbyterian and also some Protestants and also some Jesuit priests, missionaries, I should say, came into the area. But they scrambled through all the different tribes in the area because, like I said, by that point, the kingdom was breaking apart into different tribes and signed treaties with them that the British would have exclusive access to the land. So if the Portuguese tried to come in, they would say, sorry, we already signed with some other white people. They were very quick about that. This became, at least the Shire Highlands became a British protectorate in 1889. By 1890, what is now the entirety of Malawi and a few other areas nearby became like an official protectorate. They called it the British Central Africa Protectorate, and I think like a year later they just renamed it Nyasaland because that's what they'd been calling it the whole time. And of course, it being British controlled, they made sure that there was a good government, a governor, a political structure to keep everything in line that was controlled like only by the white Europeans that were settling there. And, no black people, especially Native people, would be allowed to serve. So, flash forward to the year 1944 when the first political party formed in secret in order to try to push local agendas in politics. And they really did a big push in 1953 when Britain merged their Nyasaland territory with their Rhodesia territory. You can see some of Zimbabwe down here. That was Rhodesia. And they called it the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland. Or just like the Federation, basically. And the Malawians, well, at that point, the Nyasalanders, they were called, were not happy about that at all. And there was a big nationalist movement, mainly led by a man named Hastings Banda, who was from the area, and he was a lawyer, highly educated in Europe. He was working in Ghana. He came back to lead this nationalist movement. He'd been jailed, so on and so forth. Eventually, when Britain was like, oh, we probably should just give them independence because that's what they want, they appointed him to draft out their constitution. And then he became prime minister in 1963 when the federation was officially dissolved. And on July 6, 1964, Nyasaland became independent, and they renamed it to Malawi. And they did so for the main reason that Nyasaland was like their colonizer name, and they didn't want it associated with that. So they picked Malawi because it sounds like Marawi, which was their ancient kingdom at the time. Also, Malawi apparently means like fiery waters, which refers to the sun shining off of Lake Malawi, which is really lovely, I think. So I like that name. It sounds great. So Hastings Banda became president, of course, and he quickly established a one-party state that increasingly became like a totalitarianist government, especially after he declared himself president for life in 1971. That lasted for quite a long time until the 1990s, when there was a big push for democracy. and Banda allowed it. He allowed them to have a referendum in 1993 over whether or not it should be democratic or totalitarian, and people voted for a multi-party democracy. So Banda stepped down so that he could be in the elections, like to be the officially elected president. And what was that? I didn't write it down. I think, no, he didn't win that election. Right. Yeah, he didn't win that election. But he very, gracefully handed over the power of the government. He didn't try to resist or anything. But anyway, I want to talk about the third president of Malawi who was elected in 2004. His name was Binguwa Mutharika. And when he was re-elected, it was widely deemed as fraudulent, and there were huge protests about it in 2011. And the police fired on the crowds. It left 18 dead, 44 injured, just from bullets, basically. So, I'm sure you can imagine. Well, at that, obviously Mutharika was very sympathetic and announced that he would hold another election or would step down, yada yada. None of that happened. What actually happened was he had a heart attack in the next year and died in 2012. So the government wanted to keep his death secret so as not to incite riots or anything. Also because his buddies in the government did not want the vice president to become president. It was actually a woman named Joyce Banda, no relation to Hastings Banda. So they took Mutharika's body and flew it to South Africa. And the ambulance that pulled up at the airstrip refused to take a dead body. So basically his body was stuck there in South Africa. The South African government threatened to announce his death. And also the former president was notified and was outraged that the Constitution was not being upheld. So basically their hands were tied, and the vice president, Joyce Banda, was sworn in as president. So Malawi has had a female president. But in the next election in 2014, Peter Mutharika, who was Binguwa Mutharika's brother, was elected president. There was a re-election in 2019, which was deemed very fraudulent to the point where it went to the Malawian Supreme Court and was declared very fraudulent. So they had another election in 2020, and Lazarus Chakwera was named president. And that's basically where we are today in Malawi's history. Anytime I Googled anything about Malawi, everything said that Malawians are the kindest people in Africa. That's their biggest reputation. So I think that's super awesome. And I think Malawi, has a long road to go to become a little bit more economically established. It being incredibly rural, and you can tell they're on the path to progress, but it's a very slow one, but nonetheless a path to progress it is. So big hopes for Malawi in the future, and they're very kind people that live there. So that's it for today. I'll let Topple's ears, if you haven't heard them before, send us out for the night. Put him up by the microphone here, and I'm gonna rub his ears like this. I brought out Topple because there's a lot of elephants in some of their nature reserves, and I love elephants, so that's why that's there. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this video relaxing and educational, and I hope